Hey folks, welcome back. Today's video is going to be a 16 Grimrail Depot video from the Paladin's POV. It's going to be a bit of an interesting one, I'm afraid, partially due to the fact it's a bit like a Quentin Tarantino movie, and also a bit like an Agatha Christie's Who's Fucking Done It. So, with that aside, let's get into it. So, going into the video then, you can see the build. It's Zeal, Blade of Wrath, pretty much all ones with Sanctified Wrath and Selfless Healer. If I was to replay this again, I wouldn't be using Selfless Healer, I'd instead be using Healing Hands. Quick check of the gear. My Paladin still doesn't really have any loot from Season 4 because we are playing this on a maintenance level, still prioritizing the Warlock and prepping for Dragonflight. I'm currently doing a lot of research into professions for guild purposes and things like that. Now, I am the Power Infusion target in this particular dungeon, however, as you can see there, aggro is a problem. Despite not having any gear, my Paladin still seems to generate threat like it's coming out of his ass, and if I didn't know any better, I'd say I still had something like Righteous Defender on my bars, and was instead pumping out additional threat for God knows what reason. So, a bit of a spoiler, there's going to be quite a few deaths in this dungeon, and this dungeon is out of time. Probably wasn't the best shout going straight into a 16 after an 11 the previous week, but pulled in a favour with a few friends. You've got Mad Skills in the group playing his priest and a couple of his viewers. You've got Rebemma, who is actually playing our tank for the first time. So, huge big shout out to Rebemma for doing this for me. It was greatly appreciated, and I do apologise for the amount of threat I was generating going through this dungeon. So, some of this Who's Done It is going to be a discussion about how I died, what I could have possibly done at the time of death in order to reduce what I was doing, or alternatively, being slightly more situationally aware like that. Now, I do also have this exact same key, 16, Fortified Sanguine Grievous, and obviously Shrouded on my Warlock, so I'm probably going to look over that video tomorrow, hopefully, or I will release a video of side-by-side between this and obviously a ranged POV, because one of the problems with Grimrail Depot, which you may or may not have noticed due to my UI, is the fact that Grimrail is rather rough for camera angles. It's a very tight spaced dungeon. Even this early on, there's no real wide open spaces, at least from camera POV, until you get towards the end of the dungeon, specifically the last boss space, where you have a little bit more maneuverability in where your camera looks. Now, one thing that I will discuss actually about UIs is, from a Paladin perspective, I probably need to redo my UI, especially when it comes to the melee DPS. From a range perspective, I'm usually out of the thick of it, so can see a lot more. However, as you can see, so far, this dungeon hasn't been particularly good in terms of making sure that I'm utilizing the space correctly, or am aware of mechanics going on behind me, like the Iron Star detonation that Wipe does. Because at the moment we have 6 deaths, 1 group wipe, and me dying to aggro on an occasion. Wings is obviously still very, very scary. One thing I probably need to look at more often as well, from a aggro perspective as we go through this dungeon, is probably having the tank as main target and looking at their assist target. So constantly hitting what the tank's hitting. Slightly detrimental in terms of overall DPS and what I'm able to do over the course of a dungeon, perhaps, especially when we have newer tanks such as Rebemma, but may in fact result in less aggro problems for me personally. Because although my Paladin is still in the 278, 279 range from last season, I'm still doing a considerable amount of damage within my windows, but that is partially due to how Paladins are designed. Now, one thing before we pull this boss, just to pause it, you do actually have an option when both Rocket Spark and the Brute are in the far corner, or Borka, and actually pulling the Nathrazim in the stairs and fighting there, or pulling them through the wall, in order to get the extra stacks for this boss. Probably more impactful during tyrannical weeks, but is still an option. You can see that I'm 277.13 or 277 item level. So far, to date, I've only had a pair of boots drop. I did get a second pair of boots, but they were actually worse than the ones I'd got through a dungeon. So, can't really be helped. I will try to get a little bit more gear on the Paladin, but the Warlock and prepping for Dragonflight takes priority at the moment. So, we have a slight problem in terms of kind of maintaining health. Obviously, PI is quite good on me, but this is one of those things where I think that having healing hands is probably better for me than Selfless Healer, because I'm sitting on Selfless Healer for a very long time and I never ever seem to weave Flash of Light in. Probably because a mindset perspective for me is the fact that Word of Glory is designated single target healing at the cost of damage, whereas although Flash of Light is free with Selfless Healer, as you can see it's lit up currently, it just never occurs to me to try and hit a Flash of Light during my rotation, because instinctively Flash of Light has a cast time. Now, I end up drumming here because obviously we don't have last, and I forgot to do it during the first period because whenever Rocket Spark comes down, he takes increased damage. So you want to lust during these windows. By not lusting when I did initially, people didn't really have cooldowns. So that's partially on me, but there may have been other people within the group that had drums. Now we lost our Warlock. I think he ended up standing in one of these AoE zones. Does a considerable amount of damage. What was a rather unforgiving time in terms of dungeons. But in terms of from a Paladin perspective, there's not really too much to say here. I probably shouldn't have been chasing Rocket Spark around like this, or if I was going to, I should have used Cavalier and made use of my Divine Steeds, and instead just focused on the Brute for uptime. Now, our Warlock obviously didn't bother taking the combat res because the boss was about to die anyway. And as you can see, Rocket Spark pretty much jumped onto our location and the Hammer of Wrath finished him off, which is good. Now, we're just going to fast forward slightly, because it's an Infiltrator and Zelgamok's pack. Because at the bottom of the stairs you have a target that pings out Zelgamox, and you also have an Infiltrator just behind the stairs and the ramp. Now again, I end up pulling aggro here off Zelgamox, which isn't great, but can't be helped in this occasion. Which does mean a long run back, and obviously I make it back to Zelgamox, and Zelgamox still has a reasonable amount of health left, because no one's really popping cooldowns at this stage. You've got the back going out, being dealt with, thankfully. And an interesting point of note as well from CC option, if you have druids in the group, Hibernate will work on the bats. You can put them to sleep because they are obviously a beast. Now, I know me skipping 30 seconds here and there in the video is probably a little bit unusual, but as I said at the start, this is an out of time key, unfortunately, and as a result, I am trying to make sure that it doesn't become a 40-minute long video for you guys that's relatively boring as you see me run back a lot. So there are going to be points where I die, I skip to get back into the content, and if there's anything serious within the elapsed 30 seconds, I will obviously backpedal slightly and explain where possible. Now, again, another one bites the dust, unfortunately. This is very much becoming a case of the boy done goofed. So, we've gone back 20 seconds essentially. You can see that I'm hitting this second Bombardier, the one that we've just pulled, and I have aggro. That's the point where I should have realized that things have gone wrong. Now, from a tanking perspective, and this is across the board, if you're going to be pulling multiple mobs, the especially if you're running towards them, you need to make sure that you have a decent amount of aggro on that target. You can't just run towards it and maybe hit it with a cleave. In a monk's case, a rushing jade wind. With a warrior, it could be a thunderclap or a blood boil if you're a DK. What you need to do, especially if you're already tanking something that has lost 20-30% of its health as you move into the next mob, you have to prioritize the higher health mob from an aggro perspective, especially if you have a ret paladin in the group. Because as you saw, I had wings, I was going through my rotation, and yes, I probably shouldn't have been targeting the one with the most health, but at the same time, if this was a bolstering week, as is currently the rotation, you'd want to get the health down reasonably evenly and distribute health. Always attack the thing with the highest health, which in turn means obviously there's a higher risk of me pulling threat. Now, this kind of memed throughout the dungeon that basically every time I popped wings, you could hear that voice note, and it was at this moment he knew he'd fucked up. Because I'm basically taking a lot of aggro, or as you can see now, going through the actual train itself, there's almost no space to move, especially with the infiltrators in the group, because you have the sleeps going down, you have these carrion swarm cleave frontals that do a significant amount of damage, and you have sanguine as well. So for those of you that really wanted Grimrail Depot back and voted for it, please, I beg you, in the future, try and have a think of what the dungeons are actually like in relation to modern day Mythic Plus mechanics. Because these dungeons were not designed for a time where we have these affixes. Back when we had the challenge modes, and it was a case of speed, yes, these dungeons were fantastic, kind of mythic additions, as it were. But in terms of modern day Mythic Plus, this is a really badly designed dungeon. I would much rather be in something like Waycrest Manor or Sanguine Depths, something that is a little bit more open camera-wise, because there is so much clutter, your field of view is negligible. Because look, you can see there that the beam above me was in the way of my camera. And the way that you should deal with this, in most cases, is actually pulling backwards as far as you can. And unfortunately, each carriage is basically going to be a case of backpedaling until the pack is dead, run forward, pull the next pack, and keep coming further back. Because you can see, even in between these two carriages, there's not a lot of space for the camera. Now, this particular carriage is rather dangerous, because you have this knockback, you have positional problems, and not only that, you have a pack really, really close behind us as well. So you're going to see that we do end up, in fact, ninja pulling. Not entirely sure how, but inevitably it ends up getting really rather sloppy. You can see 30 seconds later, I'm immediately dead again. Thankfully, I get back and we're okay-ish. Not too much has transpired, just fighting through the packs. Now, these packs have actually gone down with less problems while I've been dead. And this is because, unfortunately, Retribution Paladins and aggro is going to be a really big thing that we talk about here. A lot of Retribution Paladins AoE currently in Shadowlands is actually coded as single target damage. So, from a tanking perspective, we are everyone's worst nightmare. However, that's made infinitely worse when you have to consider some of our legendary choices, our abilities and things like that. Like, for instance, I have to stand with my back facing an oncoming group so that my Tempest to the Lightbringer legendary, the one that ejects a Divine Storm in front of us, doesn't in fact cause further problems and pull a pack. However, what that also means is my back is against any potential danger. So, in the case of the previous pull, as soon as anything pulls into the group, I'm immediately at risk. Now, I went back 20 seconds here because as soon as I got back to the group was falling apart anyway. So this is just a death and a reset. Now, thankfully, at this point, there's only a few deaths left in the dungeon. We're already at 25 and we haven't even made it to Nitrog yet. But this is because a lot of the pack is a problem. Now, you can, as you see, you can jump over the purple or the sleep auras that are dropped on the ground by the infiltrators, but if you're not careful, you will get caught out a lot. Now, while I was recording this, obviously I got a new subscriber, so very much thanks to them. But yeah, so this positional problem, like as you can see here, if we just go back 10 seconds and stop here, this position is ideal for my legendary usage and sending everything back where we've cleared. The problem is, though, if anyone ninjas behind me or I get knocked back or anything like that in socially aggro, from a tank's perspective, I am in hell. And there's not much they can do to save me. Which is kind of problematic, and maybe if I was playing a different melee, it probably wouldn't be too bad. I could stand on the right side of the tank. Because what I'm supposed to do, very much thinking of like a PvP setting here, is from a positional point of view, you want the tank to be ideally in between you and any future packs. Which is a slight change on PvP, where you want to be in between your healer and the enemy team. But for Tempest to the Lightbringer, in a dungeon like Grimrail Depot, I actually need to be ahead of the tank facing where we've come from. Otherwise, because of the 20-yard range, especially in something like Grimrail Depot, where these carriages are very short and Tempest of the Lightbringer can go through various obstacles, you can see where that's going. The worst case scenario is me constantly pulling stuff. Now, we're not entirely sure where this Hulk went or what he was doing for him to come back to us with half health. But, thankfully, we're rather close to the end of the problem children, I guess, in terms of these couple of carriages. Still not great. That was a rather good Mortal Coil. It was a Havoc Mortal Coil. The Warlock in our group is playing, obviously, Destruction, as you can see by the Infernals, and is doing a reasonably good job of trying to CC things. Problem is, though, some of these Mortal Coils have actually been sending things through things like Sanguine and whatever else. And it's not great. Now, having Divine Purpose paired with Healing Hands would probably have been a better shout, because going through this with the healing as it is with Grievous and things like that, using Divine Purpose procs on healing would probably have been more beneficial to the group than me trying to pump out damage, especially given how much aggro I'm actually taking off. Now, Nitrog Thunder Tower gets taken over. Up until this point throughout the course of the dungeon, the DPS hasn't exactly been the greatest. From my own personal perspective, it's been okay, but obviously early packs, like the first pack when I got the PI and died 4 or 5 seconds into it, really hasn't helped. In terms of gear, though, between me and the Warlock, we're roughly equal geared, I believe, which means that this isn't too bad of a key overall. It does get inflated during Nithrog, so it's up and from this point onwards, the DPS is very much inflated, because obviously you have access to the cannons for this encounter, and cannon damage does in fact count towards overall damage done within the dungeon. So as we go through this fight space, you're going to see that my DPS is going to skyrocket, because I'm the one that ends up with the mortars. Now, this is a key thing to pay attention to, and you can see that I'm targeted by suppressive fire. Spoiler, I'm about to die, but there's a reason for it. Now, this pillar is commonly a line of sight point. However, you need to be stood on the left-hand side of the pillar here, because what I'm getting hit by is the splash damage. So I die to splash damage even though I'm here. You can see that the radius of the explosive, the detonation, is about half a pillar width. So for anyone that's been struggling to do this fight space and is wondering where a good place to stand is, standing on this rivet next to this box is the safest place to stand. Do not get caught out like I did, thinking that these barrels and this side of the pillar was going to save your ass. Because, funnily enough, it don't. Although, interestingly enough, if you do die where I'm stood, your healer will be very, very confused. Because our boy Pleb, or Madskulls, was saying to stream at this point, because we was doing this key on his stream, was wondering how the blazing hell I died. Because, by all accounts, I'm actually stood in the correct place. But you need to be stood where he is stood currently if you fully want to avoid any potential splash damage, because you have this large, essentially crate, ISO container-esque creation here that blocks a lot more of the AoE. Thankfully, I get a heal from our boy Alpha, and we just go forward and we do a bit of damn. Now, slight quality of life thing for paladins going forward. This fight alone is probably a reason to use Cavalier over something like Unbreakable Spirit. Because yes, having Bubble on a essentially 3-minute cooldown is fantastic. And if you're worried about taking aggro, is great when you alternate that between that, Blessing of Protection, and trying to manage your aggro somewhat. However, this wind and the knockback isn't great, and is quite damaging to us. So you can see that my damage is now just spiked up, and I only had 1 mortar. I'm now trying to, you know, use other things, but I also have access to grenades and the shrapnel to use towards the ads. Now, if you're a tank and you're able to, tanking all these ads next to a cannon will speed this dungeon up, because if your DPS pick up the shrapnel, you can get into a cannon. I get targeted again. Delays the fight drastically. You can see that where I'm stood now is the correct spot. There's no splashback because it's actually hitting this side of the pillar still. So I use my Divine Steed, we get forward, and you can actually aim and hit him from this second one. You don't need to go all the way up to the top. But ideally, you'd be in a position where the tank would either pull the mobs closer down to this cannon or stay closer to that middle one, because as you saw, I'm trying to use the shrapnel, but the shrapnel has a very, very short range, and as a result is a bit of a problem. Also, just a bit of advice, do not eject yourself from a cannon facing backwards, because the wind carries you as you're being ejected. So you kind of want to get yourself ejected to the side if you can. Now, bosses like fixating my paladin. This harks back to the days of me playing flipping Emerald Nightmare in Legion as a red paladin, and Il'gynoth targeting me 112 times in one fight. In one 5-minute encounter space, I got targeted 112 times by Il'gynoth. I just spent the entire fight running around like a pleeblet. But anyway, so we've got the bombs. Could have thrown the grenades, but the grenades do knock people back, so I picked up a mortar shell and try, as best as I might on my wheelchair, get back into the fight. I drop a bomb as a test, and it doesn't seem to do any damage to the boss, so the bombs themselves only do damage to the ads. Now, you can see there that it was Pleb himself that had hopped into the thing and was using the shrapnel damage to deal with him. My mortar damage kind of put me at a lovely 30k, at a near 30k, which unfortunately massively inflates the total amount of damage I did. But, Now, thankfully we're only about 5 minutes away from completing it, but as you can see, we've only got 3 minutes left on the timer. Now, these seers are rather problematic. Thunder Zone hurts a lot. So from a tanking perspective, you want to try and keep it on one side. You don't want to be in a position where, like I just had to, I pop Shield of Vengeance to then get over it. Ideally, you want to pull the seer to here, and then during Thunder Zones, you actually want to move it further up into the fight space, which also means that all of your DPS need to be stood near the Thunder Seer so you can bait it. Now, unfortunately, this particular area is rather horrendous. These scouts are problematic at best because Arcane Blitz cannot be silenced, they cannot be stunned, they cannot be interrupted, they can't be forcibly moved in any way, shape or form, which during a Sanguine week is absolutely disgusting. Now, obviously, in a situation like this, when you have lots of ads and you can't necessarily control something, the Seer is the main target to get rid of. Thankfully, I was able to Arcane torrent the Seer's shield off them. Otherwise, that would have been a considerable amount of damage thrown at us for no reason. Now, we're able to kind of keep on top of the kicks. Digression probably could have thrown out, or the Warlock could have probably thrown out a Curse of Tongues to make this a little bit easier, because it is very, very messy when you've got the Captain, the Seer, and the Scout. But on a Sanguine week, you could argue that actually killing the Scout first is probably easier, because one of the problems with the Scout and the Arcane Blitz cast is because it casts so frequently, you then can't move it. So we tried Ring of Piecing there, it stays put, and all the while it is just healing up through Sanguine. So we get it out, and then we're trying to AoE them both down simultaneously. Now, this probably wasn't the best place to use wings, but we needed to try and get this Scout down and then get the Captain down, because the Captain can be moved once it does its relentless strikes, which isn't too bad. Chain pulling, these loaders, they're not too dangerous as long as you don't rip aggro. So for me, I'm just focusing on killing the Captain, letting the tank build up aggro for the loaders, but that Wake of Ashes still ripped aggro. I still ripped aggro off 3 targets. And that was just the Wake of Ashes. That wasn't me using wings or anything else. So still need to be wary of that, because you can see the exact moment actually if we go back 20 seconds. So actually go back 30. So we take out the Captain. They've all got 74% health-ish. We've been evenly DPSing them down. And Rebemma goes in to pull the next mobs. She chain lightninged this closer one. So barely did any damage to it, and the other just socially aggroes. I have now just waked, and you can see that moment where it's just aggro, aggro, aggro. And I'm just thinking, oh shit. Thankfully, these loaders don't do too much damage and can kind of just be face tanked, but that's still a rather scary situation. Because it means from a tanking perspective, Rebemma had changed her priority to the 2 highest target healths at that point. And the only thing potentially maintaining aggro at that point was either whatever she already had, or if she's running something like Rushing Jade Wind, was Rushing Jade Wind. So, slightly scary, but eh. Now, one thing that will be mentioned during this fight is a good place for ranged DPS to stand, because thankfully, as of last week, they changed this fight so that you could actually see the predicted textures of this Lightning Breath ability. Because during the first week of Season 4, it wasn't, and it was just an RNG guess. You can see there the blue swirlies, because that's where the Lightning ability does go, which does make this a little bit easier. Now, the only other thing that you need to be wary of is standing out of the way for the spear, because the spear is horrendous. These freeze snares, obviously paladins, monks, and hunters with post-haste can essentially forcibly clear them, as can druids. Now, what I'm hoping to show you, if we can get into a position where the camera is a little bit better, is be able to properly point out where best to stand. If we pause, sorry, we'll pause here. Right, so if I can bring your attention back to the screen, if you're just listening to this or whatever, on the side of these platforms, you have these small railings on the very, very edge of the encounter space. And as you will see in the 16 Warlock POV of Grimrail Depot, if you want me to go through that at some point, you can stand on that, and if you're very, very careful with movement, you can completely and utterly negate any of this blue lightning. You can just stand there and tunnel, and you only have to strafe slightly every time a trap is placed. Obviously, there does come an inherent risk in standing along these beams, and that is if you step backwards or you move a little bit too quickly, there's every possibility you go from being on the beam to being on the floor somewhere yonder up there as the train just whizzes past. Now, a better place to show it would be here in the top left hand corner of the screen. You can see that brown beam, which is where my Warlock ends up spending a lot of time. Obviously, only if you're very comfortable with moving and essentially stutter stepping your way around mechanics. But it is something if you're more of a stood still caster. Now, here we have a problem. I was very, very late to my Blessing of Freedom, which could have been problematic, putting it mildly. But my brain kind of went into fart mode at this point. I was very much just like, I would have did. Because obviously the time is over, and unfortunately we didn't time the key. Plus my DPS is a little bit partially due to the running around and the fact that she's not moving the greatest, but sometimes it can't be helped. So all in all, this was a bit of a cluster of a dungeon, honestly, and there's obviously a lot of room for improvement. Again, huge massive thank you to Mad Skills, Digression, Alpha Heals, and Rebemma, especially Rebemma, because this was her first time ever tanking a key. So again, thank you very much, but I do apologise for the amount of aggro my Red Paladin throws out. But going forward, hopefully in the coming weeks as we go through Season 4, my Paladin gets a little bit more gear, we can get back into the habit of threat management. Because one thing that you do need to bear in mind as well, especially if you're a multi-classer or you're playing multiple different classes, is the fact that melee DPS generate much more threat than ranged players do. So much so that the aggro threshold, if memory serves, in pulling off the tank is only something like 120% if you're a melee DPS, but you need something like 160% aggro to rip off if you're ranged. So there's generally a massive discrepancy in how much burst you can throw out either as a Warlock or as a Paladin, based on where your aggro is, which is further compounded when you consider that for Demonology Warlocks, for example, a lot of their damage comes through their pets, which means that my pet is more likely to rip aggro off the tank and get clobbered than I am. But anyway, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. I was of two minds to release it due to the fact that it's obviously by no means a perfect example of how to do Grimrail, but as I said, I would release a video weekly. So after a bit of umming and ahhing and trying to bathe this in the greatest light, I've obviously released it. Hopefully you guys enjoy, and I will see you in the next video where we'll probably be looking at my Warlock's 16 playthrough this as well, and then whatever I've managed to get done this week in terms of keys, RNG willing.